So we're still in the Yom Tif of Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz. And I'm sure you all know that I grew up here in Pittsburgh, born here, raised here, and only left home when I went, I guess the first time was the summer of Tafshin Chof Tes, when I went to camp after my bar mitzvah. And then a year later, I went to yeshiva in New York. And I was basically for 10 years in yeshiva until I got married and came back to Pittsburgh. So Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz, in those days, we didn't travel from Pittsburgh to New York, just like that. It was somewhat of a, it was a big deal. But the two times during my childhood that my father would frequently take me to the Rebbe would be on Yud Beis Tammuz and for Simchas Torah. So those are the two times during the year that I'm not going to say it was every year, but those are the two most popular times up until my bar mitzvah that I would go to New York. So Yud Beis Tammuz is a day, and Simchas Torah as well, that I associate with going to the Rebbe. So that's number one. As a matter of fact, it was customary that before a simcha or whatever, people would take a bottle of mashke to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe would pour l'chaim and give a bracha and hand back the bottle. And it was actually that at that Farbrengen on Yud Beis Tammuz Tafshin Chof Tes, the Rebbe actually requested that this tradition should no longer be, because it was literally taking up a lot of the time of the Farbrengen, right? So it wasn't that the Rebbe wasn't interested in it, but the Rebbe also was very understanding, and the Rebbe realized that the Farbrengen is thousands of people, and if the Rebbe takes off time from the Farbrengen to address somebody on a personal level, that's somewhat at the expense, everybody else's expense. So the Rebbe asked at that Farbrengen. So I'm notorious that the Farbrengen of Yud Beis Tammuz Tafshin Chof Tes was exactly 1 week before my bar mitzvah, and I did go that year for Yud Beis Tammuz, and at that Farbrengen, which was the last Farbrengen that this tradition, would take place, that I actually went over with my father with a bottle of mashke. It was actually, it was very embarrassing for me, and I'll tell you why. Because somehow my hat and jacket got left in my brother's room in his dormitory on Bedford and Dean. And here I was, and it was coming close to the Farbrengen, and we just couldn't manage to get my hat and jacket. So I want you to know that I think back to it, and I feel so, what's it called? That I went over to the Rebbe a week before my bar mitzvah without a hat and a jacket. So, listen, that's things happen. I remember my father wanted my brother maybe to go back to Bedford to get my hat and jacket, whatever, but it was too late, and it was coming close to the Farbrengen. I actually blame my brother Yisrael, because if he would have had this Hiddush Nefesh, he would have done it. So all my busha and all my embarrassment, I'm putting on his shoulders. Okay, but that's fine.
He was bar mitzvah.
What?
He was ready bar mitzvah.
Well, he was older than me. Yisrael was much. He's 5 years older than me, 4.5 years older than me. Yeah. Now he was in yeshiva already, and I left my hat and jacket in his dormitory room. Don't ask me what happened. I think he took me somewhere that day. My father, whatever, told him to entertain me or whatever. So I think he took me in the morning. He took me to the Statue of Liberty or something. So I left my hat and jacket in his room, and I should have worn my hat and jacket to the Statue of Liberty, and then wouldn't have this problem. But anyway. Like I said, on a little bit of a personal note, so it's a very nostalgic time for me, because this week is exactly a week after Yud Beis Tammuz is my birthday, and was my bar mitzvah. But when I learned the chitas of today, it also brings back some very certain connections, nostalgic connections happen. Why? Because when I was 12 years old is when my father first trained me in saying chitas. So that's that's something that I started on my 12th birthday. Now, at 12 years old, I can't say that when I would learn Tanya in the chitas, I was mostly just saying the words. I didn't really understand what I was saying. And Chumash, okay, Chumash perhaps, a little bit better. But I started chitas at my 12th birthday, which was Pashas Pinchas next week, right? And again, I don't know. That's how human nature works. There's certain, connections in the brain, whatever. I think that's what nostalgia actually means. Okay, it's a human experience called nostalgia, and it stays with you for your whole life. So when I learned today chitas, and I'm learning we just started Ageres Hatshuva. We finished the first book of Tanya. We finished Sha'ar Yichud Ve'amuna, and now we started just a couple of days ago. We started Ageres Hatshuva. So Ageres Hatshuva, I'm reading it, and this reminds me of when I first began doing chitas on a daily basis. It started with Ageres Hatshuva. Okay, so there, we got the personal stuff out of the way. But I want to go now to what's it called, to actually the Likutei Torah. We're going to go back to what we did originally, and we're going to focus on something from the Likutei Torah of this week. So this week, of course, is Pashas Balak. And again, Pashas Balak is, I started Machitas, probably with Pashas Balak.
Sorry, Rabbi, what's the parasha? I'm sorry.
Balak.
Balak?
Yes. Am I right? Am I in the wrong parsha? I hope not.
You got it right.
I got it right. Okay.
Well, Balak, if the
Balak. King Balak. So King Balak hired Bilam to curse Bnei Yisrael, right? And what happened is that rather than curse them, he ended up blessing them, much to the chagrin of Balak. Right? I hired you to curse them, and now you're blessing them. And he actually tried 3 times. He said, okay, you know what? The first time that he's blessing them, he says, okay, well, I'll take you somewhere else, right? And he took him somewhere else, and that didn't work, didn't help. So that was the second time. He says, I hired you to curse them. What are you doing? You're blessing them. To which Balaam had to answer, much to his chagrin, that he was not in control of his own prophecy. Whatever Hashem puts in his mind and in his mouth to say, that's what he's forced to say. So, and he said, and I warned you before. I warned your messengers that you had sent to bring me here. I told him, I said, listen, you're taking a gamble because we're talking about nevuah, we're talking about prophecy. Prophecy is basically, I'm just the vehicle through which Hashem expresses the prophecy. So they're not going to be my words. They're going to be Hashem's words, and he's going to say what he wants to say. So it turns out that 3 times, after 3 attempts, then Balak, at that point, he just gave up, right? So today, in today's Chumash portion for Friday, this is the 3rd attempt. And again, Bilam blesses Bnei Yisrael rather than curse them. Okay, the beginning of his blessings begins with a pasuk, Matoivu oihalecha Yaakov mishkinaisecha Yisrael. How beautiful, how wonderful are your tents, Yaakov, because he was standing up at the top of the mountain and overseeing the encampment of Bnei Yisrael, and having observed how they were living, right? The blessing that came out of his mouth was, how good are your dwellings, your tents, Mishkanisecha Yisrael, and your dwellings, O Israel. Okay, we're familiar with this pasuk because davening begins with that pasuk, right? You open up after you say the brachot in the morning, and you open up your siddur. So Shachris begins with this pasuk, Matoivu Alecha Yaakov, which was from the prophecy of Bilam. Okay. What does the Alter Rebbe say in Likutei Torah? In Likutei Torah, the Alter Rebbe asks a question. It's not his question. He quotes the question from Chazal, from the Gemara. The Gemara here, if you notice, Bilam used two different names to refer to the Jewish people, right? They're both the names of the patriarch of the 12 tribes, right? Which is the third of our forefathers, Ram, Yitzchok, and the third was Yaakov, right? And Yaakov was the father of the 12 Shvatim, right? That then became the nation of Israel, right? So we're named after Yaakov, who was also, his name was also Yisrael. Okay, that's the second name of Yaakov. Now, where did he get these names? So the first name, Yaakov, that was the name that was given to him by his father Yitzchok when he was born, because he was holding on to the akev, to this the sole, the foot of his twin brother Esav, because he wanted to be born first, so that he would have the birthright of being the firstborn. Okay, so that's the name Yaakov. His original name was Yaakov. But then we find that when Yaakov was actually escaping, so to speak, the house of Lavan, his cousin, right? We have the story where Yaakov went back in order to retrieve some things, and he had to cross over a small river. And what happened? It was early in the morning, and he ends up being confronted by what turns out to be the Malach of Esav. Okay, the Malach means that he was not really a physical person. He was the Malach in the form of a person who came and he confronted Yaakov, because Yaakov was now on his way to again join back up, so to speak, with his brother Esav, from whom he fled in the first place when he went to live with Lavan. So, of course, now he's coming back with a whole family of 12 children. And, well, no, but Yaman wasn't born yet, right? But whatever, but he was coming back with a large family. And then the Torah tells us this interesting story of where Yaakov went back to retrieve what's called the Pachim Ktanim, some small things that were left over. That's a whole interesting thing in itself. Like what was it that Yaakov was so concerned about? But we won't get into that right now. But the bottom line is that the story is that he's confronted by the Malach, the angel of Esav, and they get into a little confrontation, a physical confrontation, and Yaakov was struck in his leg, in his thigh, and a very interesting mitzvah, somehow evolved from that. And that's the mitzvah of the Gid Hanasha. We won't get too much into that either. But interestingly, this Malach was the one who told Yaakov that your name should no longer be referred to as Yaakov. He gave him a new name, and the new name was Yisrael. Okay? So now he has a new name, Yisrael. So interestingly, in this blessing of Bilam, he mentions both Yaakov and Yisrael. Okay? Hazal ask an interesting question. When it comes to Avram, his grandfather, right? Yaakov's grandfather, we know that his name was originally Avram, like I just said, right? But then Hashem added a hey. And his name is Avraham. And the pasuk goes on to say that no longer should you be referred to as Avram. You should be referred to only as Avraham with the hey. And so we do indeed. We refer to Avraham as Avraham. Okay? Then the Gemara goes on to say that if somebody refers to Avraham with his original name, it's a transgression because he's going against the pasuk that says clearly, La Yikra et Shimcha Avraham. Your name should no longer be referred to as the original name Avraham. Comes the Gemara and asks the question, so why by Avraham, you're not allowed to call him Avraham anymore? But when it comes to Yaakov, where his name was also changed, right? And the Malach said something very similar. Your name is no longer Yaakov, now your name is Yisrael. And just incidentally, the reason he gave was Kisarisa im Elokim, right? Because you just demonstrated that you're able to quarrel and to battle with the messenger of Hashem, which was the Malach of Yosef, right? And he gave him a new name based on that, Yisrael. Now, there's a lot of significance to that name. Again, we're not going to get into that right now, except for one nekuda. The Gemara says, so how come we find that there's no lav, there's no prohibition against referring to Yisrael as back to his original name, Yaakov? He's constantly being referred to as both Abraham, as both Yisrael and Yaakov. And as we see here in this blessing of Bilam, he says, Matoivu heilecha Yaakov, Mishkin noisecha Yisrael. So here, we find that he is still referred to by his original name as well. So the Gemara answers. The Gemara says the difference is that when it comes to Avraham, you don't find in Chumash any reference to his original name Avraham, right? But when it comes to Yisrael, to Yaakov, right, we find that the Torah itself interchanges between Yisrael and Yaakov. So this is an indication that we are permitted to refer both as Yaakov and as Yisrael. Okay, so that would be the distinction. Very interesting. Halachically speaking, okay? That's what the Gemara says. The Hadar Hadrikra. The Gemara, the pasuk itself goes back to referring to it's interchangeable between Yaakov and Yisrael. Says the Alter Rebbe, so what's the pshat? What's behind this? The Alter Rebbe basically says that the name Yisrael is a reference to the ultimate best of a yid. He says it's synonymous with a tzaddik gomor, an absolute righteous person, right? Yaakov, on the other hand, Yaakov represents the struggling Jew, the Jew that the Alter Rebbe wrote the whole book of Tanya for, referred to in Tanya as the Beinoni. The Beinoni is the Yid who does not necessarily and not consistently represent the best of who he is, but rather, Chas v'shalom, he can even succumb to what's called his Yetzer Hara, his Nefesh Habamis, right? And when we speak about a Jew, that Jew, the struggling Jew, the one that is dealing with things that Hashem is certainly not proud of, and he himself is not even proud of, right? Then he is referred to as Yaakov. See it actually in the name itself, because Yaakov, as Yitzchok, when he called him Yaakov, was because he was holding on to the Akev. He was holding on to the heel of all people, of his twin brother Esav. Okay, and yet Yitzchok saw it appropriate to include in the name of Yaakov the concept of the heel, the Akev, right? So from this, Chassidus says that Yaakov is a representation of a Yid, but a Yid as a Yid could unfortunately sometimes slip from his true state of existence, and sometimes he'll even succumb to the nefesh abamis or the Yetzer Hara. Okay, but there's also the name Yisrael. What does the name Yisrael tell us? The name Yisrael tells us that you should know that even though he could sometimes act on the level of an akev, of a soul, not the way a Yid is supposed to behave, not the way a Yid is supposed to act, right? Nonetheless, he still maintains the name Yisrael. He maintains that name because that name actually describes his true existence, his true essence. Question: if that's his true essence, then why even let's do like what the Torah tells us to do with Avraham? No longer will you be called Avraham. Now that we know that the true essence of a Yid is the Yisrael, it's a level that can even be victorious in a confrontation with Hashem's own messengers, his own malachim, because he's actually connected to a place even higher than the malach. Sorisam Elokim, right? The Tuchal, you were able to have this struggle and this confrontation even with Elokim, with Hashem. And here it doesn't mean Hashem, it means his messenger, because Elokim is sometimes used for his malachim, right? And Vatuchal, somehow you prevailed, you were able to do it. That's an indication of who you really, really are. And yet, we still find that, in spite of the fact that this is the true essence of a Yid, nonetheless, we are still referred to as Yaakov. So the Alter Rebbe says, and this is a very fundamental thing that comes up over and over, the Alter Rebbe says, yes, the true essence of a Yid is Yisrael, meaning that in essence, your true persona is that of a tzaddik gamur. But Hashem, and by the way, he said, your neshama, before it comes down into this world, your neshama is for sure a tzaddik gamur. Before the neshama descends into this world, so it doesn't have any association whatsoever with the body, and certainly not with what's called the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul. That's something that's only a feature of this physical world. It does not exist in the spiritual worlds. It has its source in the spiritual world, from the chayis of the Merkava, etc., etc. Okay, we won't get into that right now. But the bottom line is that the neshama, before it descends into this world, is clearly, says the Alter Rebbe. It's interesting. The Alter Rebbe says, "Bevadai, he's certainly on the level of a tzaddik." Let me see where the Alter Rebbe says it. Hein bevadai tzaddikim gemurim. The neshama is most certainly, without any doubt, the neshama is a tzaddik gamur, right? However, there's something that even the tzaddik gamur does not necessarily have. What is that? That is the amazing advantage that the person who's called a Baal Tshuva. What is a Baal Tshuva? A person who did succumb to his nefesh habamis, and then he returned to Hashem, right? So later in the Maimer actually speaks about this tshuva of the Baal Tshuva. As a matter of fact, when it comes to the name Yaakov, we find interestingly that his brother Esav said something to his brother when he somehow tricked him into selling him the birthright of the Bechor, of the firstborn. He says, you tricked me twice, right? And the Alter Rebbe, later in this Maimon, Alter Rebbe explains that there's actually two levels of tshuva. V'yakveinu zupamayim are the two levels of tshuva. And then he goes on to say that there's actually a third level as well, okay? But the first two levels are obviously, these are levels of tshuva where a person experienced, that which brought him to a state where he has to do tshuva, right? that person, the third level of tshuva is when he reconnects completely and totally to his true essence, which is the Yisrael, right? But the Yaakov part of a Jew, right? Yaakvei nizu pamayim, there's two different levels of tshuva that deals with that, the reality of the Yid who actually makes mistakes, and he does tshuva, he comes back, and now he's called about tshuva. And what do we know about tshuva? So first, the Alter Rebbe quotes a Mishnah from Pirkei Avos, "The Yofe she'achas b'tshuva ma'asim tevim mikol chayei ha'olam haba." There's an amazing advantage of living in this world and actually doing tshuva in this world, living in this world, right? Which cannot, the whole olam haba doesn't even come close, right? One moment in this world, struggling with the unfortunate realities of this world, when the Yid prevails, and now he's called a Bal Tshuva, he's not a tzaddik, because a tzaddik is perfect. He's not perfect, but he dealt with his imperfections, right? And he came out of them, and the Mishnah tells us very clearly that this is just one time. We're not talking about a lifetime of this kind of engaging, with all of the mistakes that you make. Even if one time, if a Yid one time, experiences the great, the status that he acquires by doing tshuva, all of the Elam Hava is certainly not worth, and that's why it doesn't even connect. It doesn't even come close, right? And that's why, says the Alter Rebbe, the neshama that was on the highest possible level that could be, the purest level, pristine, perfect place in the spiritual realms, right? Nonetheless, Hashem says that this neshama should come down into a guf. Total, complete culture shock for the neshama, right? And experience the process of being a Beinoni, which is synonymous, a Beinoni, one who deals with a Nefesh Abamis, which is ultimately, inevitably, the Beinoni is going to deal with his Nefesh Abamis. It's just a fact of life. I don't think you can avoid it, right? Unless you are actually a tzaddik, and they're very, very rare, right? I even think that when the Alter Rebbe speaks about a person in this world who's called a tzaddik, it's almost like it's just like some kind of hypothetical, right? Because I don't know that a physical person can actually truly, truly, truly be that level of tzaddik, which is the absolute perfection, okay? That means that even the tzaddikim that come in this world, so we call them tzaddikim, right? But they still are here in this world, right? Because although they happen to be, compared to the regular shmos like us, right? So they happen to be on a very, very high level, and they remind us of this idea of a tzaddik, right? But what are they there for? They're there to guide us. They're there to help us through. So they also have to be human beings, because otherwise, how could they ever even, they're like so completely and totally in a different level, they wouldn't be able to relate to us at all, right? So they're also part of the system of Baal Tshuva, because they're here to help the Beinoni become a Baal Tshuva, right? And I'll even venture to say that on some level they also deal with the unfortunate realities of this physical world. Okay, we know that, for example, because it says that even a tzaddik, he still has to eat, right? Which he doesn't have to, but the neshama doesn't have to do in the spiritual world. He also has to sleep, right? He also has a mitzvah to have children, right? So he's completely and totally engaged in things that are very much, the realm, the nefesh abamis, area, eating, sleeping, etc., right? So even a tzaddik, we call him tzaddik. When you compare him to the regular Beinoni, you see a person and you say, this person, I can imagine him having a nefesh abamis. But the truth is that no, he's also in this world, right? And he's also here, his neshama is here in order to benefit from the experience of being a Baal Tshuva, okay? I mean, this tells us something very interesting. When we say that a Baal Tshuva is synonymous with a Beinoni, that's kind of interesting because the Beinoni, according to the Alter Rebbe and Tanya, never actually transgresses anything, right? So a Baal Tshuva doesn't necessarily have to be someone that actually transgressed. A Baal Tshuva is just a person, right, who, like any Beinoni, as much as he's able to safeguard his behavior, even his thoughts, right? That's the ultimate Beinoni. And that's what we're all striving to be. There's one thing he can't avoid, though. He cannot avoid having to deal with the Nefesh HaBamis. So when the Alter Rebbe explains, like, what happens, a fleeting moment in the life of a Beinoni, what would that moment look like? So the Alter Rebbe says, something's going to pop into his head, right? Where's that thought coming from? It's coming from that animal. It is definitely coming from the Nefesh HaBamis. What does the Beinoni do? Miyad al Yosef neshama. As soon as it pops into the head, he pushes it away with two hands, right? So he didn't chas v'shalom, he didn't listen to his own thoughts. He pushed them out of his head, right? But he dealt with the behemoth, right? So therefore, having dealt with that behemoth, he achieves the level of a Baal Tshuva, about which the Chazal tell us, in the place that a Baal Tshuva stands, even the greatest tzaddik is not worthy of being standing in his place. Okay, Chaim, you're wondering, are we going to get to the title of today's shir? Yeah, we'll get to the title.
It can be bait and switch. It's fun.
What?
It's like a bait and switch.
I have to watch the clock. I'll watch the clock. We'll make sure we'll get to Hashem's love for Yid. Okay.
So
Here,
we look at the calendar.
This is why when it comes to the name change of Yaakov, and he was named Yisrael, we still maintain the name Yaakov. This actually goes back to our topic that we spoke about the last couple lessons, and that was in an abstract level, because Sharif Damuna speaks about the God and his relationship with creation and so on and so forth in some very abstract ways. And we spoke about the terminology that's used in the Kabbalah, which is called the upper unity and the lower unity and so on and so forth, right? And we wonder which is true. So in a sense, the upper unity is the ultimate truth, that nothing exists except for Hashem, right? But then what's the point of having the lower unity, where the lower unity says, no, God created a world, and he created a world where he's actually he pretends to not be present in that world, so to speak. Because of the Yehudei law, we can't say that that's true, because nothing but Hashem, right? But the Yehudei Tata tells us that Hashem created a world, right? And it's possible that from the perspective of that world, you see a void, God forbid, of Hashem's presence. You see that void. What's the purpose of it? The purpose of it is because Hashem didn't create the neshama and the world so that the neshama should stay in that pristine state. That neshama has to come into a world where there's this other reality called Yehudei Tata. Yehudei Tata means that there does seem to be an independent state of existence with its own, with its own protocol, with its own, interests and so on and so forth, right? Remember, like we compared it to the son of the king and the servant of the king. The son of the king, just by nature, whatever the king wants, that's what he wants. But the servant, no, it's his anniversary. The king says, I'm sorry, call your wife, tell her you're not going to make it for the anniversary. So he might be disappointed, but he's a good Eved, and he's going to do exactly. He's going to call his wife. He says, listen, the king needs me. Our anniversary will have to wait. Okay? So the Eved is a person that's living he has his own priorities. He has, well, I should call them priorities. He has another life, but he puts that life aside because he actually prioritizes the needs of the king. So here again, this is the difference between the neshama, the way it's in Gan Eden. It has no other reality. Its only reality is the reality of Hashem. This is how the Alter Rebbe describes the tzaddik in the first book of Tanya, there's never shliach bamis. His Yetzer Hara somehow doesn't seem to be a factor in his life, right? He doesn't get these ideas popping into his head, right? But then ultimately, it's the Yehuda Tato that when Hashem created the world, he wanted there to be this state of unity, which is not a perfect absolute unity. It's a struggle unity. It's the same struggle of the Baal Tshuva, right? The one who has prevailed over a reality that's actually very much in conflict with Hashem's reality. Okay? That's why, says the Alter Rebbe, yes, our essence is Yisrael. But I'm going to put you in a place where you are now also going to be in a place that from your perspective, you're going to see yourself as a Yaakov. It's not as perfect as Yisrael, right? And in spite of the fact that that is who you really, really are, right? In spite of the fact that that is who you really are, I'm putting you in a place where that's not going to be obvious to you all the time. You're going to be times that you say, where is my Yisrael? Why am I having this struggle? What am I, who needs this? I'm Yisrael, right? Says Hashem, no. Yaakov is still a reality that I want to exist. And ultimately, just to like, what's always the bottom line is because even the Yisrael has limits as to how close it could get to my essence. When you speak about the essence of Hashem, it's not the tzaddik, it's not the Baal Tshuva. But the Baal Tshuva has the opportunity to actually connect with my essence. In other words, the essence of Hashem transcends both the Yehuda Elah and the Yehuda Tata. So Yehuda Elah itself, being a perfect neshama that has no struggles whatsoever, yes, that's wonderful and beautiful, but ultimately it still has a certain limit as to how close it can connect to the essence of Hashem. Because the essence of Hashem is not more impressed with the tzaddik than he is with the Baal Tshuva, and you could even say he's perhaps even more impressed with the Baal Tshuva, right? Who lives in the world that seems to be or allow and have even the capacity of a Helen, of a somewhat of Hashem being hidden to the point where he may even appear to be completely void, right? Ultimately, it's that level that brings a yid closer to, it brings a yid ultimately to the essence of Hashem. Okay, so that wraps up also the Yehuda Elah, Yehuda Tata conversation. So Yehuda Tata, not the absolute unity, is actually a state of reality that allows for the process of actually connecting with Hashem's essence. The higher level of Yehuda Elah that's represented in the life of this, so to speak, perfect neshama or the tzaddik, right? Does not connect with the essence of Hashem. Okay. In today's chitas, right, also reminds me of another minor that we're not going to get to until towards the end of the summer. Actually, it's going to be already in Chodesh Elul. And that's when we are going to read Parshas Ki Seitzei. Okay, because in Parshas Ki Seitzei, now let's remember, and I've said this so many times, that we're not yet at Chumash Devarim, but in a couple of weeks, right? Next week, Pinchas, I think Matis Maseh is together, so we have another few weeks until we start Chumash Devarim. What's so special about Chumash Devarim? And I've said this so many times. The Chumash Devarim begins telling us that it's already past the 40 years of the Midbar. We're already past the 40 years, even now. The whole story of Balak happened after the 40 years. But we're past the 40 years. And they're actually on the banks of the Yarden, preparing to cross the Yarden in order to inherit the promised land of Eretz Yisrael, right? Moshe Rabbeinu knows that he is not crossing the Yarden with them. He's going to stay behind. But he is Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe Rabbeinu, if I'm not going to go with them, at least I'm going to call everybody together for a major Farbrengen. So you can quote me on this one because I don't know if there's anyone else who refers to it as such. And but I coined the term that Chumash Devarim started on a Chodesh Shvat, as the very beginning of Chumash Devarim tells us. It was a Chodesh Shvat. They were at the banks of the Jordan River, and Hayel Moshe began to speak. And for the next 5 weeks, Chumash Devarim basically spans 5 weeks, and basically it's Moshe Rabbeinu literally preparing Bnei Yisrael for the new life of actually not being tzaddikim. In the Midbar, you could say they were on the level of tzaddikim because they didn't have to deal with the physical world. But they're going to cross the Yarden, and they're going to now deal with the Yehuda Tato'ah. They're going to deal with a world where, ironically, they're going to Eretz Yisrael, but at the same time, it's they're not going to have as much time to sit and learn Torah like they did in the Midbar, because there's going to be all kinds of distractions. They're going to have to work the land. They're going to have to earn up parnasa, etc., right? In a very holy way, of course, because it's in Eretz Yisrael. But it's going to be somewhat deviation from the lifestyle that they were used to in the Midbar, right? I mean, the Medrash, the Zohar, has some very flowery terms to describe the Yidden during that time, the 40 years. It calls them a Dardeya. It's kind of like it seems to be like in contradiction with the stories and the struggles, right? That brought them in the first place to have to spend the 40 years. But at the same time, they were living such a perfect life, right? People dream of a life like that, right? But then when they get there, they look back and they yearn for the times when they did have to work, But that's what's happening. They're going into Eretz Yisrael. It's going to be it's going to be a completely, a new paradigm shift in their lifestyle. Right? So Moshe, and they're going to now experience what it means to have to do tshuva. Okay. So on a personal level, all right, having individual on a personal level. So Moshe Rabbeinu has this Farbrengen, this 5-week Farbrengen from Chodesh Shvat until the end of Zois HaBracha, where Moshe Rabbeinu, the pasuk tells us that on the 7th day of Adar, right, 5 weeks after Rosh Chodesh Adar, Moshe Rabbeinu passes away. Okay, so this is how Moshe Rabbeinu spent the last 5 weeks of his life, right? So we have here Bilam. This week we are studying the story of Bilam. What's the story of Bilam? That Bilam was hired to curse Bnei Yisrael, and turns out that he didn't curse them, but rather he blessed them. Okay. In Parshas Kiseitze, the Moshe Rabbeinu, part of the Farbrengen, was reminiscing the 40 years in the Midbar, right? There are some things that Moshe had to somewhat reprimand them, right? There's some, some harsh words in Chumash Devarim, no question about it. But, out of Farbrengen, sometimes the Mashpia, has to say as it is, right? He does it with love, of course, but he can't avoid, the realities. And they need to be mentioned, they need to be addressed. Okay. But there were other times when Moshe was just reminiscing some of what took place. Now, one of the things that Moshe Rabbeinu in Parshas Kiseitze we find is that he speaks about what happened when they were coming close to the land of Moav, right? And they were told that they cannot, that's not part of their inheritance. They don't take over the land of Moav, right? But yet Balak was concerned and he was afraid, and Balak decided to hire Bilam in order to curse the Bnei Yisrael. And Moshe Rabbeinu just mentions it, right? And he mentions, but do you remember what happened? Do you remember what happened when this whole thing occurred? And he says as follows: Le'ova Hashem lishmaya el Bilam. Hashem did not desire, he did not want to hear what Bilam had to say, right? And what did he do? He took all of his curses and he transformed them into blessings. Okay? Says the Alter Rebbe in Parshas Kiseitze. So he's has a mimer on the pasuk where Moshe Rabbeinu is reminiscing and he's mentioning what happened with Bilam, who was hired by Balak, right? And he says that, do you remember what happened? Right? It wasn't so long ago. It was just a little while ago, right? Hashem didn't want to listen to Bilam. So the Alter Rebbe begins with a very interesting question. He says, Hashem didn't want to listen to Bilam. And the way the Alter Rebbe words it is kind of interesting. He says, who would want to listen to Bilam, right? Like, what's the big deal that he didn't want to listen to Bilam, right? It's very, sometimes the Alter Rebbe sometimes uses these very frank, expressions, right? and he asks a question, right? Obviously, the question is leading to a deeper interpretation, but the way the Alter Rebbe poses the question, oh, Bilam, Hashem didn't want to listen to Bilam. Says the Alter Rebbe, and who would want to listen to Bilam, right? He wasn't the most sterling of character, right? He wasn't the most wonderful person in the world, right? And Hashem didn't want to listen to him. Says the Alter Rebbe, let me tell you what this means. Let me tell you what Moshe Rabbeinu was reminding Bnei Yisrael, okay? As opposed to Yaakov. What was he telling them? He says, listen. He says, if you look careful at the psukim from today's Pasha in Balak, right? The third time, in the third attempt, that Balak was still hoping that maybe he will get Bilam to actually curse them and not bless them, right? So he says that he took them to Rosh HaPeor, right? He took them to a mountain which was called the Rosh HaPeor, the head of Peor, right? And he says, maybe from here you will actually be successful in cursing them. It seems that this was Bilam's idea. So, because Rashi says that what is the significance of the fact that they were standing on the Rosh HaPeor? Because you see, Bilam knew that very soon the Yidden are going to actually sin with the idol of Peor. And that's actually next week in Pashas Pinchas, right? We're going to, it'll reference that sin, okay? Next week, Pashas Pinchas, you'll read more about it, okay? Bilam was clever, and he knew that. Not only that, there's also another pasuk where it says that he looked over Al Pnei Yishimain, over the desert, and by doing that, he was trying to invoke the sin of the Egel Hazov that took place 40 years earlier. Okay? So what's Bilam thinking? Bilam is thinking, oh, I think I know how to get into God's mind. I think I have a very clever way of getting Hashem to actually go along with our plan to curse the Bnei Yisrael. What am I going to do? I'm going to do the things that I happen to know that upsets Hashem very much, to the point that Hashem actually punishes the Bnei Yisrael, right? And what does he do? He does things that will somehow, divert the attention to the inequities of the Jewish people. That's what's actually being merumos. This is being somehow hinted to when the pasuk tells us where it was that they chose to stand in the third attempt to curse the Bnei Yisrael. Out of frustration, he says, this is not working. I have to find another method. I think this will work. I will mention their sins, right? Maybe that will help. What does Moshe Rabbeinu tell us? He says, how did the story go? He was clever, Bilam, right? He says that Bilam was like the kateger. He's like the Satan. What does the Satan do? The Satan, like for example, we speak about the Yom Hadin, Shoshana, Yom Kippur, the Satan is always coming into the picture. Why is he coming into the picture? Because here we're standing in judgment, right? Seres Yemei Tshuva is basically the 10 days that we stand in judgment. We call Hashem HaMelech HaMishpat, not just right, not just Ayev Mishpat. He's the king, and we are standing in judgment. And judgment means that the judgment could go one way, could go Chas v'Shalom the other way, right? So we tremble, these days of awe, as they're referred to, Yom Neroyim, days of awe. And then the Alter Rebbe says, but we have our ways, So one of them is that we blow the shofar, and by blowing the shofar, we basically, that is our defense against the Satan. Okay, but the Satan is a player, right? We blow the shofar and we blow away the Satan, so to speak. Okay. The reality, though, is that there's such a thing as a Satan, and he's very clever, right? And he tries to weigh the din. He weighs the judgment that it should not be in favor of Bnei Yisrael. Says Moshe, look, Bilam is a Satan. He was clever. He was a Makatrik. He was what's a Makatrik in English? He was the prosecutor. He was the prosecutor, appointed by the Department of Justice in order to find fault with Bnei Yisrael. And he did it in a very clever way, right? He invoked the memory of things that he knew, so to speak, angered Hashem, right? What does Moshe Rabbeinu remind? Le'ava Hashem l'shmaya lebilam. And here the Alter Rebbe says another very interesting expression. Not that he was wrong. Bilam was right. They did do these things that these invoking the memory of. Says Moshe Rabbeinu, do you understand the relationship that you have with Hashem? In spite of the fact, here we're sitting at a Fabrengen, and I'm bringing up some not so pleasant memories, right? But at the end of the day, do you understand what happened? Bilam literally touched a raw nerve. And who knows what could have happened? What did happen? Le'ava Hashem l'shmaya el Bilam. Says, you who did the things you shouldn't have done, that was your Yaakov. Okay, deal with it. But at the same time, that never in any way takes away the element of Yisrael. So that element of Yisrael is what saves you. It saves you over and over and over again. It saved us from the curses of Bilam, because Hashem said, I don't want to hear what you have to say. Why? Because if I listen to what you have to say, I'm going to give it credence, and then I'm going to have to actually present a counter argument. And what does Moshe tell us that Hashem did? He said, get out of here. I don't even want to hear what you say. You know I don't want to hear what you say? Yeah, I hate Hashem lekecha, because Hashem loves you. What does Hashem loves? He loves the fact, both that you're Yisrael, that never ever on that level separates from Hashem, but you're also the Yaakov, who when you do seemingly separate from Hashem, you always find a way to come back to your Yisrael. So this is the Mateva Lecha Yaakov Mishkan Yisrael. We have the unfortunate realities that only affect that the Yaakov deals with, but ultimately Hashem looks at us and he sees the Yisrael and he says, I know, it's my fault. I put you in that situation where you could be a Yaakov, you could be a heel, but ultimately I have the full trust that you will come back to your true essence, to your Yisrael. And therefore, Bilam, I have no interest in what Bilam has to say. I don't even want to argue with him. I'm not going to give him the satisfaction of knowing that he hit a raw nerve. I'm just going to cancel him. Hashem was the first to cancel. He canceled Bilam, basically. So if you have any issues with the cancel culture, you can take it up with Hashem himself, because he was the first to invoke the cancel culture, because he completely and totally just canceled Bilam. And this, my dear friends, is what I would like to share with you today. And thank you for listening.